welcome to a special presentation of Rights and Democracy Television, RADTV. I'm Shay Totten, I'm with Rights and Democracy, and today we have a very special conversation about what is a social contract and what can we be doing to make our world and our communities more just and more renewable. We have some extremely special guests with us today that I'm going to introduce now, and we're going to jump right into the conversation. So first, I'm going to start with just to my right, Kathy Albisa, who is with NESRI, and we're going to get a little bit more about what each of these organizations does and what people do. Jennifer Flynn Walker from Center for Popular Democracy Action. James Haslam, who's co-founder and executive director at Rights and Democracy. Tracy Corder, who's also a Center for Popular Democracy Action. And a special guest, Addie Barkin, also Center for Popular Democracy Action, and also part of, as you'll see we're all wearing some buttons that say "Be a Hero" and some T-shirts that say "Be a Hero." We've got the merch up here, and it's because Tracy, Addie, and Jennifer are here as part of the Be a Hero tour, which has been going across the country for the past 6 weeks, correct? Touring around, having conversations like this about what we can be doing in our communities to make the world more just and renewable and really equitable for all. And we're going to talk a lot about that today with some of the work that both we're doing at Rights and Democracy, some emergent initiatives that are happening around the country, and then where do we go from here and how do social justice organizations like ourselves do that kind of work out and beyond. So one of the great things is that by the time you see this, you may have missed it, but Addie and the Be a Hero Tour, we're glad and really proud to, as Rights and Democracy, to host them both for 3 stops here in Vermont, in Brattleboro, Bennington, and Bristol, and then 3 stops over in New Hampshire, where we also, Rights and Democracy is also organizing, in Claremont, Manchester, and Rochester. And here in Vermont, he's going to be joined by someone you might also know, U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders, along the tour some of the Rights and Democracy endorsed candidates in the upcoming primary Tuesday, August 14th. In New Hampshire, we're going to be doing again some rallies and some organizing and getting people out to knock on doors in these important midterm elections, especially over in New Hampshire, where there's an effort to flip the House and to hold the Congressional District 1. And then specifically in Manchester, we're going to be calling on Governor Chris Sununu over there to stand up for health care and to sort of push back against the appointment of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. So very action-packed 2 days with Rights and Democracy and the Be a Hero Tour. We're extremely excited to have you be part of this and to be lifting up our work and ours to sort of lift up and bring attention to the work you've been doing. And so, I want to just start. I'm going to start with Kathy a little bit, and we're going to give you a little more time at the end of the show to really talk about more of what you've heard elsewhere around this Be a Hero Tour, which has been incredibly inspiring to watch. So for folks, go out there and check it out. If you haven't heard about it, it's winding down now, but there's still plenty of work to be done beyond this tour. So Kathy, I want to start with you.
Okay.
We talk about this term that's the program is how can we build this movement toward a new social contract and a real democracy. When we say social contract, what is a social contract?
Yeah, well, obviously a social contract it's a metaphor. It's not an actual contract. And it sort of fills in for the idea that there's a certain set of assumptions that we all have in terms of what we expect from our society, right? And our last social contract, which was mostly premised on the idea that we should have some basic social safety net, some fairness, some opportunity, some decent work, has been unraveling for some time. And we're in a very unstable political landscape, right? Which opens up the question, what does a new social contract look like? How do we get to a place where we have a sustainable and deep democracy, and we bring our economy back to a place where we're building community and people feel like they have a brighter future, rather than the very anxious place we are right now? How do we change that? And a lot of the work that's going on with the Be a Hero Tour and with Rights and Democracy is all towards that end. And this is really about having a more thoughtful conversation to discuss, what does that look like? What do people want? What kind of assumptions should we be living under? What are our expectations going forward? Because the social contract we currently have is falling to pieces. And it's a moment for real political imagination to build something better.
Great, and I'm just going to go right down now. I'll start with you, Jennifer, to talk a little bit about. Thank you, Kathy, for that sort of opening sort of frame and sort of what we're talking about. Maybe now, have each of the 4 of you next talk a little bit about since a lot of this action work and these tours you're doing, you're meeting and finding organizations and individuals who are kind of doing that work at sort of the base, at the community level, and maybe talk a little bit about what does it look like in a community, and what are people doing right now to either hold on to it or build something new around this sort of concept, this metaphorical concept of a social contract. I'll start with you, Jennifer, and we'll just go right down.
So I think that one of the most inspiring places, one of the most inspiring community organizations is, quite frankly, Rights and Democracy, who's really kind of taken on this idea of, we're not just going to keep fighting for the piecemeal things that seem like small victories. We're going to demand the things that we all want. And, they grew out, or you all grew out of the movement for a universal healthcare system in the state of Vermont. And obviously now that is a national movement. And we're seeing, we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity in this next election, this next presidential election. It's either the end of the world or this is our chance to actually get the things that we've all wanted. So I was part of the fight to save the Affordable Care Act. And in the first recess, the first congressional recess in January, 100,000 people who were actually counted by organizations, 100,000 people showed up, and they spoke out mostly for healthcare. 10,000 distinct actions as counted by the Democratic Party, so that might be a little bit off, but it's probably generally right. They took place to save the Affordable Care Act. There was that much passion so that we could get healthcare. We see, Congress members or people running for Congress like Kara Eastman in Nebraska, who actually entered the race because they they knew people who were going to die if they didn't have access to health care, and so many people in our country don't have that. And now we see all of these people saying, well, we saved the Affordable Care Act mostly, but now we want to actually fight for Medicare for all. We want to actually make sure that we're not just getting a little bit of health care for just some people. We want to have the whole thing. And I think one of the genius things about RAD is that you guys are like, we want health care, we want to make sure that we have access to housing, we want to make sure that everybody who's hungry has food, or there should be no one who's hungry, everyone has access to food, and everyone should have enough education to just be able to succeed and thrive. And so I think that really RAD is at the forefront of the demand for this new social contract.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that compliment. We've been very excited to be part of a movement around the country with groups like ours, that go deep in our own communities, but are part of a national movement. So that that we realize that our lot in Vermont and in New Hampshire is deeply, obviously tied with what's happening in this country, and we found that in our struggle for universal health care. It's very hard for states to go it alone. And we need, in this, we totally agree that right now people are really, windows opening, that we can fight to win healthcare as a human right. We think of this when Kathy called us and talked about this idea of pushing for, the frame of a new social contract. It obviously is right in alignment with what we're thinking when we say rights and democracy. All of these things, as Jennifer was saying, healthcare, housing, education. They're all connected, and we think of them as essentially, power struggles. That if we can get together and demand our right to health care, we can make it so. No one's going to give it to us, and it's a power struggle. And when Kathy was saying, the social contract that we had has been unraveling, it's not by accident. There's a power struggle happening on the opposite side. We're in a very polarized situation, but the Koch brothers of the world are very systematically trying to dismantle anything that resembles a social contract, from Social Security to what we have for healthcare programs. And so we're fighting in the opposite direction. And we think that exactly right, that we're at a pivotal point in this country to take bold strides in the other direction.
Tracy.
So I do the racial justice campaign work at Center for Popular Democracy Action, and kind of our cornerstone campaign is Freedom to Thrive, which is really this aspirational campaign that has concrete steps about what does it look like for communities not to survive, not to just do a little bit better, but to actually dream about a society where we can all thrive. And I do trainings, envisioning with people all over the country to talk about that. And so it's been both, it's encouraging to like really talk about dreaming, but it also shows me how we've limited people to just electoral wins and losses, and why we can't do that. So I was working with a youth group in Milwaukee, Leaders Igniting Transformation, or LIT as they're called. And I was like, what do you guys want to see? And they gave me this they gave me this like small thing, because we do this to people, and they said, we want to see 15% less suspensions by this year. I was like, no. Y'all are 16 years old. What do you want to see? And then we had a real conversation. They said they didn't want to see their friends be suspended anymore, and they didn't want to have cops in their classrooms, and they didn't want to see themselves being criminalized by things that their parents' generation was kind of sternly looked at for. Right? And so it's really important that we, as we talk about building out the social contract, really talk about being aspirational and being visionary when it comes to the things that we demand as far as policy, whether it comes to the candidates that we're working for. It's no longer enough to just say, I'm going to get this person in because they're better than that person. We have to be saying, I'm going to get this person in because this is a person I believe in. And the same thing with our policies.
I really appreciate the question and the frame, because I do think it's so important for us to be putting forward a North Star that we can all work to, even if we recognize that victories are often incremental or that compromises have to be made. We should be orienting our work around a bold vision for a new social contract that includes these guarantees to a dignified life. The guarantee that we all have the freedom to thrive. So a couple of examples. In New York, they're moving forward legislation now that would guarantee fast food workers the right to their job and to not be fired without just cause. So you can't just be laid off because the boss doesn't like you, or has an inkling that you may try to start a union soon. And that kind of job security, usually only comes with a union contract, but enshrining that into law can really empower people. In San Francisco, there's been for a long time a guarantee to health care. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, we're seeing the mayors there reject calls for more funding for police, and instead commitments to put that money towards things that really make communities safe, like public housing and education. In Charlottesville, which was the site of the terrible Nazi rally, the vice mayor led on an effort to guarantee underserved community members access to college and housing through an explicitly racial justice framework. So I think there are lots of examples. Kathy can surely give us more, but I think it behooves us as a national movement to take these examples and craft them into a bold vision that we can all fight for in a coordinated and collaborative way.
Thank you. I'm really glad you mentioned that word North Star. It's something as a, as a communications director at Rights and Democracy, working across both states, as we sort of think about these sort of the big ideas and the big issues, is trying to be put people out to a North Star. I mean, I think the idea is, if it's and as as Tracy, as you mentioned too, it's that's what we should be doing, right? We should be saying, think big, because if you ask for big things, sometimes people you get them, right? I mean, it's like one of those basic tenets. If you don't ask for something big, you're not going to get it. But hearing what they've said, so I'd like to, Kathy, is are there other examples that you've come up with, and sort of the work that Nesri's done, and sort of looking at what organizations and other are out there that's out there that maybe didn't get addressed? I know one of the issues that you've talked about before, and this would be something that viewers on this station will know quite a bit about, which are land trusts and cooperatives. We're fairly we have some great models around housing cooperatives in Vermont, as well as land trust models for home ownership. But what are some other sort of ideas that are out there that talk about this sort of almost democratization of kind of everything, really, where we all have our part?
Right, and I think that there are lots of them. Communities have come up with a number of really bold and transformative solutions that we know are working. They've been out there working for many years, whether it's community land trusts or community control green energy, whether it's participatory budgeting, whether it's public banks. We've had one in North Dakota for 100 years, and we have people trying to set them up elsewhere. They work shockingly well. Postal banking to meet the needs of people who aren't having their banking needs met. There are a lot of really, and by the way, we used to have some postal banking in this country about close to 100 years ago. So these are ideas that have been tested, that we know work. And more importantly, I think the question we're trying to ask here is, what do they add up to? How does it change what we have now? You hear a lot about things like public-private partnerships. Well, why is our government partnering with corporations? When corporations is what's undermining our democracy, with corporations is is the corporate structures extracting wealth from communities and leaving people bereft of any capacity to meet their own needs. Why not a model that's really about public-community partnerships, right? That rebuilds local democracy, that we look at models that communities are already pushing forward, and we actually have government support for those models. And we create a country that's grounded in public-community partnership. We include the risk solidarity and the income solidarity that things like a universal healthcare system would provide. But we also look at how we rebuild neighborhoods from the ground up with government support. People should not have to do this on their own while our government is receiving subsidies and unending support. Our corporations are receiving subsidies and unending support from our government.
Great. What are some other other big ideas? But I guess more importantly, how do we get there, right? I mean, it's like what is our plan? Like, we like to talk about backwards plans. Like, where do we start and work backwards from? I mean, we have all this out there, but how do we transform that narrative? And I think one of the things that we often see is that we'll often see sort of great sort of ideas get co-opted pretty quickly. I've even seen the sort of the universal wage or universal income. Who's pushing it now? It's like tech companies. I mean, sort of if you've anyone seen the movie Sorry to Bother You, I mean, you can sort of see almost like where that could be headed. On the far side of things. But how do we get there, and what are sort of the other sort of tactics and the tools that we have available to us that our organizations are already using to kind of get there? And what's the narrative we want to change, and who's our audience, and is it political? Is it electoral? Is it community-based building like we're doing now? Is it everything above?
It's all of it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the conversation about narrative shift is so important, and it has to be beyond elections. Like, we can't just be talking to people for their vote. We actually have to be engaging people so that they see voting as a way to power build. So we just saw an election that happened in St. Louis County that got out the police or the prosecutor who didn't prosecute the cop who murdered Mike Brown. And so people have been talking to folks for years, and those conversations are going to continue. So now this community feels empowered because they've actually voted as a block and pushed someone out who they didn't want, and they can continue to build upon that. But it's also about having the hard conversations. When I walked into Rights and Democracy's office, I saw Ella Baker quote. Like, that's not what you see in everybody's office. So just seeing that is huge. And like being able to follow the lead of communities of color who have been kind of in resistance mode for 400 years is huge when it's about when it's white allies doing it. So it's the kind of year-round civic engagement that we're seeing that Black and brown communities have been doing. It's white folks having hard conversations. It's power building. It's not just going into people's communities and using them for a vote, and actually talking about how to build a collective agenda together. And it's really understanding that this big money is going to try to separate us, so the only thing that can hold us together is some solidarity that we build from the ground up.
Can I, and
Yeah.
yeah, and just to add to that, I think the co-optable question is really, really an important one. The other thing I would add, I agree with all of that, but I would add that we also need to be very clear on what are our principles. You know, how we get there is also important, right? And what are our principles? The tech sector is not pushing UBI because they want a more equitable society. So how do we really push consistently for concepts like equity, for the fact that we need universal systems, the everybody in, nobody out approach, for the fact that we need community control, and that we need to drain the speculation in our economy, because that's what's concentrating wealth. And equity speculation is on one end of the spectrum, equity is on the other. And I'll give you an example of something that's going on in Baltimore. So you said things often get watered down, things often get co-opted. How do we get there? Part of how we get there is being clear and knowing what we're asking for. You also said if you don't ask for something big, you don't get it. So Baltimore has about 40,000 empty, decaying homes, and a major housing crisis, among other things, and a very speculative development approach. It has a history of redlining, everything you would expect that creates problems in a community. It turns out that activists and community members and organizations there discovered that out of the 22,000 homes that are sold every year, 16,000 are sold by for-profit entities. They're not being sold by the owner. They're being sold for speculation.
Wow.
And so then they said, well, let's ask for something different then. If you're selling a home for speculation, you're not an owner selling it to another owner, then you should pay higher taxes. You should pay a higher recordation tax, and that should be put into a fund for affordable housing. You know, we need to think about what are the actual, how do we create solidarity, but to ask for way different ways of moving money and moving policies and changing structures, so that we are not only divesting from criminalization, but also from displacement and from speculation, and investing in communities.
Let me jump in with two ideas. The first about what we're demanding, and the second about how we get there. So number one, I think for me, one major key is to shift away from the narrative or model of scarcity towards one of abundance and human dignity and the freedom to thrive. We should always keep in mind we live in the richest country in the history of human civilization. We spend uncountable, inconceivable amounts of money on our military, on incarceration. There really is enough money to guarantee all of the things that we know are necessary for a just life: housing, clean energy, education, healthcare. The money exists. And I think all of our political conversations should proceed from that vision. But now I actually, on point number two, have a slightly different fear, Kathy and Tracy, from the one you expressed about having the ideas be co-opted. I'm more worried about the ideas being ignored. The number of smart policy papers documents and ideas that have been written down by our movement in recent decades and that never get liftoff. So to me, I mean, obviously, I don't want the ideas to be co-opted, but the question of how do we even make them appealing enough and popular enough that someone would want to co-opt them. And I think the answer, and maybe others can chime in, is about electoralizing and making these demands political. Because I agree, we have to have narrative shifts. Changing hearts and minds is in many ways the fundamental move you have to make to achieve long-term change in this society. But to get there, you need a huge megaphone that really engages people in a sustained way. And politics allows us both to get the megaphone and then use it and build on it and get those incremental and sometimes big wins that allow us to put this agenda in front of people and show that it works. So I would love to hear from others how you think we might be able to politicize and electoralize this agenda.
So we have this amazing opportunity before us. We have the midterm elections and then pretty much going right into the presidential election. We're positioned to have the most energized electoral cycle that we've ever seen. And this is a time for everyday folks who don't write policy papers, who maybe aren't sitting here discussing these big ideas, to actually put them into practice. The one time when people who have their hand on the switch to give you what you want are out and available to us is when they're running for office. And the upside of them having to fundraise all the time is that they are here, they're in New Hampshire already fundraising for presidential campaigns, for their friends who might run for presidential campaigns. And you, every single person who's watching this, can go out and bird dog them, ask them questions, keep repeating and asking them questions about, are they going to give you Medicare for all? Are they going to give you a guaranteed jobs bill? And a lot of the people who are running, who will be running for president, are actually sitting Congress members, sitting senators, and when one of them comes out, the further that we can push them to, towards giving us what we want, to committing, then the rest of them have to say, oh, well, I'm going to do something about that too. So even if we don't get the entire dream social contract, we will at least get much closer to what we have now, what we thought was possible, if all of us start to asking about it now, because this is our opportunity.
Well, and Shay, you asked us to think about, where would we want to be and work backwards from that.
And picking up where Avi said too, because I think it does talk about, how do we move that national conversation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not impossible. And, and as Jennifer had just pointed out, I mean, while Vermont's electoral votes are never really always up for grabs in any kind of big way, and New Hampshire's are because it's the first in the nation primary. So it has an incredible opportunity. There's lots of media, lots of megaphones to be grabbed, right? So how do we get there?
Well, partly the beautiful thing about what we're talking about with the social contract is these are the values of our communities. Our opponents, you can see what they do. They find any ways to divide us, to keep people apathetic, and they don't want people to vote. They're trying to figure out how to dismantle democracy because what they have is a very, frankly, unpopular agenda. But somehow they're the ones calling the shots because they've rigged the system in the way. What we have on our side is that if you get an opportunity to knock on somebody's door, sit down in their living room, and talk about these things, the things that their families care about and are struggling with. That's what we're talking about with the new social contract, is how do we have a transformation in priorities and having them, you know, really in alignment with the moral priorities of our communities. And in New Hampshire, you know, because of the primary system, there's a huge focus in the presidential election. And we're going to have an opportunity. So, you know, we look back, you know, a year from now, you know, the fall of 2019, we would love to have done enormous work to be able to have these conversations, to build with communities, so that when, as Jennifer says, when people come around and say, you know, vote for me, that we have organized communities that can say, well, where do you stand on these issues? Are you going to stand with us for Medicare for All? Are you going to commit to, you know, putting more money into education than into locking people up, and be able to put them on record every stop of the way, and have it not be about personalities when that election comes, but really be about a program for the people and the planet, and not for, you know, billionaires and profiteers. And we have that opportunity to, you know, bring them together with forums.
And let's be clear, we are already moving this national conversation. It's how do we make it go faster? A couple of years ago, you would have never heard about federal jobs guarantees coming from winning candidates. You would have not had a real serious political conversation about Medicare for All. During the ACA process, they wouldn't even have a hearing. You know, the nurses were getting arrested just to get a hearing. It was a real deficit in democracy, right? So that conversation is moving. The real question is, and I think it sort of leads us back to the Be a Hero tour, is how do we build the power to accelerate it and move it from a conversation to a new framework that we're actually operating in.
And I think you're right, Kathy. So just to share a bit about what we've been doing on this tour for the past 6 weeks. We began on June 30th with a massive rally of 75,000 people in Los Angeles, demanding that families be kept together to end the violence at the border. And then we've taken a bus, a wheelchair accessible RV, through 21 states, over 30 congressional districts, talking to voters and activists about the kind of world they want to see, about the social contract they believe in, and about how to electoralize that demand. And we've said that there are a couple of ways that people can be heroes, given that our elected officials largely are refusing to take heroic votes. Number one, the way that Jennifer mentioned, we can tell our own stories, confront the elected officials, demand that they listen to us, and come clean about what they stand for and what they don't. And number two, here in this election, everyone can become an organizer, can have those conversations with your neighbors and classmates and coworkers and family members about why this election matters, about voting, and making sure that in this midterm we have turnout as if Bernie or Hillary or Barack were on the ballot, not like a traditional midterm where only 1 in 5 or 1 in 3 voters turns out. If we can have a real landslide in November with many progressives winning office and undermining Republican control, that will position us in 2019 and 2020 to to be putting forward this bold vision and making the 2020 presidential election not just a referendum on Trump's horrible agenda and horrible personality, but in fact a referendum on our bold vision for justice and equity and the freedom to thrive. So our tour has been urging folks to get involved, to fight hard, and frankly, to fight like our lives depend on it, because for many millions of us, they really do.
Thank you.
And
Yeah, Jason,
I also wanted to add, like, no matter where we are, whether Adi's like at a pancake breakfast with veterans in Nevada, or if we're in Detroit at one of our affiliates, the conversation is the same. We're not saying what wins in this room, right? Like, we're not saying, okay, I need to water this down here to talk about this with these people. Like, it's consistently about our values. And so storytelling and talking about the issues that matter to us and the principles and the values are the thing that wins. And that's how we build together. And that's one of I think the things that's been the most beautiful about the tour since we've been on.
As a communications person, I love hearing that. Anything else from the tour you want to add, Jennifer? And then I'll come back to Adi again, and then I think we'll wind down a little bit. But
I was just gonna say we're so happy to be here in Vermont today and tomorrow, in New Hampshire and Maine to close out this tour over the weekend. There really is an opportunity for everyone to find community organizations like Rights and Democracy to get involved. One of the gospels that I've been trying to preach is that being part of a movement is not only good because it helps us reach that more just world together, but really it's a personally empowering and liberating experience to be part of a community, to be fighting for what you believe in, even if we end up losing or winning only a piece of what we want. It is a pathway towards friendship and solidarity and liberation. So I hope everyone watching reaches out to Rights and Democracy and gets involved, because it's a fight worth being a part of.
Thank you, Adi. Thank you, everyone, for being on the panel. Is there anyone else want to top that for a closer? Because you'd be hard pressed to try, but you're welcome to. But I wouldn't. So I want to thank everyone. We do have information on the Rights and Democracy website, radvt.org, about Adi and the Be a Hero tour. So you can find more information about what they've been up to, and even though they're winding down, but also find out ways you can get involved, not just with us, but also just sort of to be tapped into really what is really part of a national movement to kind of move this conversation forward. And you may be already doing it, not know it. So that would be that's also wonderful. There's ways in which we can amplify that. So thanks so much for the special presentation of Rights and Democracy Television. Thanks to all our great guests. We're looking forward to a couple of busy days here in Vermont and New Hampshire. Make sure if you're in Vermont and you see this beforehand, make sure you get out and vote Tuesday, August 14th, and check the Rights and Democracy website for the Rights and Democracy endorsed candidates in your district and around the state that our members and our leaders have recommended to you to cast a ballot for. Thank you very much.